All right, today we're going to explore this concept of self-esteem. It gets thrown around there a lot, and I just want to give like basic set of primitives that constitute this concept. So, what is it? Self-esteem, it's not a mood and it's not an attitude. It is really the core rationale for life itself. It's this structural property that makes effort make sense. It's the thing that allows human beings to say, I will try. And I want to give a definition of this concept that is very clear. Self-esteem is the belief that I belong in this world and I deserve to be happy. And that might sound like a lot to you. might sound like more than you're entitled to, more than humans should believe. But I'm going to kind of make the case today for why we should at least define self-esteem that way. And then we can wrestle with whether or not it's a concept we want to accept. So there is kind of an origin story to this concept of self-esteem. Nathaniel Branden is kind of the father of the modern self-esteem movement. In the modern world, Branden is the person who's most associated with a structured theory of self-esteem. He has his PhD in psychology. He has a very interesting story. I recommend that you kind of read up or Google Nathaniel Branden. And I would actually, I would recommend his book, Honoring the Self, to you. It was the first book on self-esteem I had ever read, and it really changed my life. Actually, I have a whole video on that I'll link below. But Branden's work defined self-esteem not as self-love, but as the conviction of one's worthiness to live and the confidence in one's ability to think and choose and act. So I've got a little quote from Nathaniel Branden here that I want to read you. Self-esteem is the disposition to experience oneself as competent to cope with the basic challenges of life and as worthy of happiness. So I love that quote. Branden basically, elaborating on this concept, identifies two fundamental pillars. He actually has a book called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, but at the core are really like two fundamental concepts in self-esteem. And you have to understand these two concepts in order to understand self-esteem on a higher level. These two concepts are self-efficacy and self-respect. Self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to handle life. Self-efficacy is your belief in your ability to handle life. Self-respect is your belief in your right to be alive, act, and thrive. Self-respect is your belief in your right to be alive and to act and to thrive. And Branden's theory positions self-esteem as essential, not optional, for agency, for decision-making, and for moral coherence in life. However, there's been a lot of pushback in this concept of self-esteem. You probably know this because of the fact that self-esteem has kind of this like flaccid reputation, right? As this kind of like really, really impotent concept, and that it doesn't really do much on its own, and that it's just it's not a very powerful concept. It's something that maybe they might teach kids about in public schools to help them set higher goals for themselves, right? But not something that you would see as like a core survival concept. And so there was a lot of pushback on this concept actually, despite the clarity that Branden brings to the concept of self-esteem. The idea of self-esteem really has drawn criticism from two major directions in psychology. The first is the behaviorist critique of self-esteem. So critics from the behavioral school argue that self-esteem is basically too internal, too subjective, too unmeasurable. That what really matters is not how you feel about yourself, but what you do. Behavioral outcomes over internal states. That should be our focus, right? So that's the behaviorist critique. The other critique is the cultural sociological critique. Others argue that self-esteem is too individualistic, that it places the burden of emotional and psychological well-being entirely on the individual, without acknowledging the impact of systems and trauma and structural oppression. And then I would say there is what I would call self-deprecating critique, which is that people shouldn't have individual self-esteem because it's basically too selfish and too haughty and too prideful to have self-esteem, right? So you've got these three critiques, right? The behaviorist critique, that behavioral outcomes matter over internal states like self-esteem. The cultural sociological critique, which is that self-esteem is not within one's control due to external factors, and therefore we shouldn't use it as a tool. And then the self-deprecating or anti-egoist critique, which is that self-esteem is like a prideful concept and therefore bad for the person and bad for society, right? And all of these critiques I think they bring valid concerns from their respective value systems. But they often misunderstand the structural nature of what Branden was describing. See, self-esteem, read the behaviorist critique, self-esteem is not a feeling. It's not a soft affirmation, not a signal of social worth. And it's not haughtiness either. It's the internal infrastructure that makes voluntary action possible. Self-esteem, see, you have to understand that self-esteem is structural. It is existential. It is the foundation of action. Self-esteem is the basis of the continuity of our personalities. And the first thing to fracture when you start lying to yourself is your self-esteem. Without self-esteem, nothing about you generates sufficient reasons to try, to show up, to wake up. And without self-esteem, every action feels borrowed. Every pursuit feels like conditional and tentative. Every grasp at identity that you might have, every claim to personhood feels like unstable and unfounded. The internal condition that allows you to act with conviction is called self-esteem. The belief that you rightfully belong in this world is called self-esteem. Without self-esteem, nothing about you generates that sufficient reason to try. So if you've ever said, I have low self-esteem, what exactly do you mean? Right? This isn't just a therapeutic concept. It's the foundation of action. And if you don't understand it clearly, you'll spend your entire life, as I've spent most of my life, trying to borrow a sense of self from performance, from praise, from proximity to others, from status, from lots of things that will never really fill that void. So, what we're going to cover today, basically, is we'll define self-esteem structurally, beyond feeling good or beyond being liked or anything like that, and we'll look at a clean, testable model for self-esteem, which is basically integrity times competence minus self-deception. Okay, that's our formula for self-esteem. It's integrity times competence minus self-deception. So we're also going to look at the contributions of Nathaniel Branden and where people often misunderstood his theory. We're going to look at those two big major criticisms that we saw of the self-esteem concept and basically what they miss, the behaviorist and the sociological and cultural. And then we're going to look at how to apply that model in high pressure situations. And then finally, we're going to look at kind of a single daily question that reinforces structural self-trust over time. Branden was really big on these self questions that you ask yourself. What if I brought 5% more consciousness? What if I thought 5% better about this situation? What would I think? What if I brought, a little bit more attention to this situation? How would I act? Branden was very big on these kinds of questions, so I want to incorporate some of his methodology. So self-esteem is the foundation of action, and if you don't understand it clearly, you will spend your life trying to borrow that from others, from other things, from outside sources that are not really designed to give that to you. Right? Most people can't define it precisely. They think it's about confidence or likability or feeling good in their own skin, right? But when pressure hits and when you fail and when you get rejected or when you break a promise to yourself, those good feelings evaporate. And what's left? That's your real self-esteem. This is not a mood. It is not self-love. That's something else. It's not a self-help affirmation. That's something else. Self-esteem is structural. Self-esteem is the internal trust you have in your own agency and your conviction that it is worthy of your attention and trust, especially under constraint. It's your ability to act and to reflect and to stay coherent when everything else is trying to pull you off center. So that's why that formula we use is self-esteem equals integrity times competence minus self-deception. So here are the three. Let's dig into that formula. Okay, three forces that really make or break self-esteem. First one is integrity. So integrity is not about being perfect. It's about being consistent with what you say you value. And if you say honesty matters, but you lie constantly to maintain comfort, your esteem drops. If you say you value fitness, but you skip every workout, you're not just missing a rep, you're breaking internal trust. Self-esteem cracks these breaches, not because you're judging yourself, but because your system is logging these contradictions, right? So that's integrity. Now, let's move on to the concept of competence. This is your track record of solving problems. Not potential, it's not your talent, just raw, provable ability to produce outcomes in the real world, right? Competence is not always loud, which is why you often have to look for these things in your own life, in your own behavior. It's that quiet confidence of knowing, I've done this under load before, I can do it again. And the more you demonstrate competence to yourself, the more esteem you have in yourself to bear more and more and more. You're either in that vicious cycle of breaking integrity or that virtuous cycle of building a sense of competence through integrity. So when you avoid feedback or you delay challenges or you stay in these like low stakes loops, you stall your own self-esteem because you're not producing evidence for it to hook into. And then finally, we have self-deception. So we have integrity, we have competence, right? Self-esteem is integrity times competence minus self-deception, right? So this is the part that most people ignore, but it's actually the most corrosive. You cannot build self-esteem on lies. You cannot fool it. You cannot trick it. Self-esteem is corroded by lies. You can't build self-esteem on lies. And that includes telling one to yourself, right? Saying you care but refusing to act. Claiming capability but ducking discomfort. When you pretend something doesn't bother you, but you're being wrecked. Branden called this self-deception evasion. These acts of evasion corrupt and corrode and evaporate our self-esteem. That it's evasion for Nathaniel Branden. Evasion is the refusal to look at reality. It's the refusal to look directly at reality. And it doesn't collapse you at all, like all at once. It distorts your perception incrementally. That's what evasion does. That's why it's so easy to fall into, because it's so easy to miss. The gap between who you say you are and what you allow yourself to see, it grows very quietly until your internal system no longer synchronizes with the truth. So even if you're acting in alignment and performing well, self-esteem erodes because you know you're avoiding something. So let's use just like a real example from real life, right? One that's like very related, like directly related to self-esteem. So a real example is what happens when you get hit with tough feedback in life. Okay, you're in a meeting, someone criticizes your work, you flinch, you defend, maybe you even spiral, right? Why? Because you're not sure what's true. You don't know whether to trust yourself. If your integrity is strong, then you think, I don't fake who I am. And if your competence is built, you think, I can fix this. And if you're honest with yourself and you don't self-deceive, then you don't fear what might be true. So that's the loop, right? Integrity, when you receive this tough feedback from somebody that criticizes you, ouch, right? Like integrity stabilizes your identity. Competence stabilizes your action. And honesty keeps the structure from corrupting. And when all three are in place, you don't break, you adapt. So here's how we kind of break down and move away from self-deception that corrodes our self-esteem. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people who struggle with self-esteem, and I did for a very long time, they're not broken people. They're just not being honest about something very important. They say they value growth, but they avoid every hard truth. They say they want respect, but they lie to keep the peace. They say they're doing their best, but they hide in distraction and performance. And it's not like shameful stuff. It's just real and it's fixable. And the solution to these situations in which you deceive yourself is not to love yourself more. It's to reduce the internal contradiction. The more you stop lying to yourself, even subtly, the more your self-esteem stabilizes. So let's move into that Nathaniel Branden methodology. What's, for example, with self-esteem? How do we reinforce self-esteem? Well, here's one daily question that kind of changes everything, right? Because like we could go into this and you can actually like get really into the nuances of this. And it's actually kind of fun, but you don't need like a 5-step system to build self-esteem. You just need one clear signal. Okay. Here's the question. Am I ignoring any evidence here? That's it. No journaling, no over-processing, just brutal clarity in the moment. Am I ignoring any evidence here? Ask it during a disagreement. Ask it when you're procrastinating. Ask it before making a decision, right? It breaks the self-deception loop. And over time, your integrity strengthens and your competence compounds and self-deception shrinks. So you can stop, prioritizing the question, do I love myself enough? And you start saying, do I trust myself? Right? So exchange your instinct to ask, do I love myself? For an instinct to ask, do I trust myself? And the way to answer yes to that question, do I trust myself? Is by continually asking that deeper question. Am I ignoring any evidence here? So here's what we covered today. I really tried to break down this concept of self-esteem into a really digestible way while also giving you some context on how it came about, right? We reframed self-esteem from emotion to structure, and we learned a precise formula, which is that self-esteem is integrity times competence minus self-deception, right? We learned how integrity stabilizes your identity, competence reinforces your agency, and honesty keeps the whole system intact, right? We saw where Branden's model came from, how it's been challenged, and why some of those challenges fall short. And you now have this single daily question. Am I ignoring any evidence here? To begin reinforcing your clarity. Or another way to put it, if you really feel like you understand that concept of evasion, what am I evading here? Am I evading? Am I evading? Right? Because this isn't about how you feel about yourself. It's about the quality of your internal structure. And am I evading gets to the heart of whether you have a high quality or low quality internal structure, right? It's this system that Branden spent his life mapping, right? Earned through behavior, sharpened by awareness and focus and consciousness. If you look up Nathaniel Branden, he talks a lot about conscious focus. Thinking is the core, the foundation, the root of self-esteem, right? Self-esteem is earned through behavior. It's sharpened by awareness. It's sustained by reality. And critics say self-esteem is soft. But softness doesn't really hold under stress, right? That's self-love, that's self-affirmation. And those concepts are fine, but they don't do what self-esteem does. And yet many people reject self-esteem because they think they're trying to be a good person. But it's actually core critical. It is the key nutrients for our survival. And so self-esteem is who you are when pressure hits, and you don't look away. That's real self-esteem, not emotional self-regard, not borrowed self-image, but what Branden called the lived experience of worth and efficacy. Remember, self-esteem is the combination of self-efficacy and self-respect. Self-efficacy being the conviction that I can handle life on its own terms, and self-respect, which is that I deserve to be here, right? And we earn those things through alignment, sharpened through evidence, and defended through honesty. Again, this is not emotional self-regard, right? This is real self-esteem, and it's different from self-love. It's different from self-affirmation, and it's not haughtiness, right? And it's not some mushy subjective state. Self-esteem is the conviction that I am worthy of this life, that I belong here, and that I deserve to be happy. And I hope that you find a way to make that concept useful for you.